Listen carefully. Some histories do not fade, they wait. They wait in ledgers burned, names erased, and silences enforced so completely that even memory itself learns to lie. What you are about to hear was never meant to survive. And once you hear it, you will understand why. December 1873. The Mississippi Delta did not sleep that winter. Fog clung to the cypress trees like a witness afraid to speak. The war was over, the chains were supposedly broken, yet power had only changed its uniform. Men no longer shouted orders with whips in their hands, they whispered contracts, debts, and favors behind closed doors. Freedom existed on paper. Control lived everywhere else. At the center of this system stood a man the parish called the Baron. Not because he had earned the title, but because everyone behaved as if he had. He owned land, yes, but more importantly, he owned records, names, obligations, futures. His authority did not come from violence alone. It came from belief. The belief that resistance was useless, that silence was survival. 2 weeks before Christmas, the Baron traveled south to New Orleans. He returned with gifts wrapped not in paper, but in secrecy. Twin girls, 14 years old. Their names were removed before they ever arrived. That detail matters, because erasing a name is the first step in erasing a soul. They were not bought publicly. This was no auction block spectacle. This was a private transaction conducted among men who understood discretion as a form of loyalty. The girls were never entered into official labor records. No bill of sale survives. No ledger entry admits they existed. And yet, every powerful family in the parish knew. The Baron did not see them as children. He saw them as instruments, lessons, a way to educate his sons in the true mechanics of power, the unspoken rules that survived emancipation untouched. That some lives were still considered property, as long as everyone agreed not to look too closely. The estate prepared for Christmas as if nothing was wrong. Candles were lit. Food was served. Hymns were sung. And somewhere inside that grand house, 2 identical shadows stood perfectly still, watching, listening, learning. Because what the Baron never understood, what men like him always miss, is that observation is power's greatest weakness. And when those who are meant to be invisible begin to see clearly, entire systems start to rot from the inside. This is not a story about innocence lost. This is a story about control miscalculated. And the moment it began to fail quietly, patiently, and without mercy. The twins were installed into the house the way one installs furniture, placed carefully, positioned precisely, and spoken about only when necessary. The Baron did not introduce them by name. He referred to them as the girls, as if individuality itself were an inconvenience. That too was deliberate. Names create attachment. Attachment weakens control. They were housed in a narrow servants' corridor on the 3rd floor, far from the quarters, far from witnesses. The servants were instructed not to speak to them unless spoken to. The sons were instructed that no instruction was needed at all. Silence was the contract. Complicity was assumed. What the Baron believed, what men of his class always believed, was that power flowed in one direction. Downward. He believed terror froze thought. That obedience erased memory. That children, stripped of context and community, became pliable. This belief had sustained empires. It had survived revolutions. It had survived emancipation. And it had grown arrogant. The twins listened. They listened to the servants whispering in kitchens after midnight. They listened to the sons boasting when drunk, careless with secrets because they had never faced consequences. They listened to the Baron speak to lawyers and bankers in his study, discussing debts like chess pieces and men like numbers. They listened long enough to understand something crucial. Power did not live in strength. It lived in systems, in documents, in reputations, in the shared agreement to look away. The girls learned the rhythms of the house. When doors were locked, when guards were absent, when alcohol made truth spill faster than blood ever could. They learned which servants feared the Baron and which merely endured him. They learned who hated the sons quietly and who resented them loudly enough to be dangerous. Most importantly, they learned that the Baron kept everything. copies of contracts that should not exist, records that contradicted public filings, evidence of crimes hidden behind legal language. He believed documentation protected him. He believed paper was control made permanent. He was right until it wasn't, because the twins were not broken. They were converging. Two minds trained under identical pressure do something rare. They synchronize. They share intuition without speech. They become a closed circuit, invisible to those who assume fear creates chaos. By January, the house felt different. Servants later said the air had changed, that the sons became restless, that the Baron seemed distracted, agitated by something he could not name. Control systems always sense disruption before they understand it. And the twins, moving silently through halls not meant for them, were no longer just watching. They were mapping. This is where the story stops being about victims and becomes about architects. By February, the parish ledger began to bleed contradictions. A debt forgiven without explanation. A signature appearing where none should exist. A land transfer recorded, then quietly reversed. Clerks blamed ink errors. Lawyers blamed assistants. The Baron blamed incompetence and demanded silence. What no one understood was that the twins had learned the language of power. Not speech, documentation. They understood that truth did not matter, only what could be proven, filed, and enforced. And more importantly, what could be exposed. The Baron's study was his sanctum. He allowed no one inside unsupervised. Except, occasionally, the girls. He believed proximity reinforced dominance. That letting them see the machinery would intimidate them into submission. Instead, it educated them. They memorized where he stored duplicate keys, which drawers were decoys, which documents he reread when anxious, which letters he burned and which he kept. Men like the Baron never destroy everything. They keep trophies, insurance, leverage. The twins understood leverage instinctively. They did not steal documents outright. That would have triggered suspicion. They altered, adjusted, moved pages one position forward or back. Small changes, invisible ones, the kind that only matter when compared against something else. Then they waited. In March, an audit was requested by an external creditor. Routine, unthreatening, until it wasn't. The records did not align. Dates conflicted. Obligations contradicted one another. The Baron found himself unable to prove ownership he had claimed for decades. His authority began to fracture not publicly, but privately, where fear lives. The sons felt it first. Their protections weakened. Their threats lost weight. Workers hesitated. Lawyers delayed. Men who once bowed began asking questions framed as favors. This is how power collapses. Not with violence but with hesitation. The twins did not celebrate. They did not rush. They understood something men like the Baron never do. Systems destroy themselves when allowed to continue unchecked under scrutiny. Exposure is more effective than rebellion. By April, rumors reached the courthouse. Illegal holdings, falsified emancipation records, children listed as assets long after abolition, names erased deliberately, lives converted into liabilities. The parish leaders panicked not because they were innocent, but because they were implicated. The Baron was not an anomaly. He was a node. And nodes, when compromised, threaten the entire network. This is when the decision was made. Not to investigate, not to prosecute, but to erase. The fire started at night. Officially, it was an accident. A faulty lamp, an old roof, dry paper. The courthouse burned quickly, hungrily, as if it had been waiting. Records turned to ash. Names disappeared forever. Histories collapsed into smoke that drifted across the town like absolution. What the fire destroyed was not evidence but accountability. The Baron vanished 3 days later. No body. No funeral. No explanation. His sons were found alive, but emptied, withdrawn, incoherent, stripped of the arrogance that once defined them. Whatever they had learned, it broke them in a way punishment never could. And the twins? They were never reported missing. That silence is the loudest detail of all. Before I go further, you need to understand something. This is the moment where awareness becomes choice. If you are still listening, comment the phrase "the ledger remembers" twice below. Not once, twice. This is not superstition, it is alignment. It signals that you recognize systems do not forget. They are only rewritten. The parish relocated its records. Officials denied the winter ever happened. Historians labeled the incident a clerical gap. And men who had once benefited from the Baron's empire lived long, comfortable lives. But networks adapt. The twins were absorbed into something older than abolition, older than the Republic itself. A quiet infrastructure that moved people, information, and leverage across state lines. Not rebels, not saviors, custodians of inconvenient truth. You will never find their names. That was the price of survival. But you will find their fingerprints, moments where corruption imploded without explanation, where powerful men resigned suddenly, where records contradicted reputations. This is how suppressed truth operates. It does not scream. It destabilizes. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is the part they never teach you. History is not controlled by those who rule openly. It is controlled by those who manage records, narratives, and disappearance. The Baron believed ownership was dominance. He believed fear was permanence. He was wrong. The twins did not defeat him with force. They exposed the fragility of a system built on mutual silence. They understood that when everyone is guilty, truth becomes radioactive. Institutions survive by pretending anomalies are accidents, by isolating collapse instead of tracing cause. The parish burned its past to protect its future, and in doing so, confirmed everything the twins had learned. This pattern repeats. Always. Modern systems are cleaner, digital, abstract. But the psychology is unchanged. Control still depends on obscurity, on complexity that discourages scrutiny, on the assumption that no one will look long enough to connect the pieces. You are living inside the descendant of that same ledger. Debt has replaced chains. Reputation has replaced ownership. Compliance has replaced obedience. And silence is still the currency that keeps the machine running. The reason this story feels dangerous is because it is familiar. Not in detail but in structure. Two invisible observers learned how power actually works, then let it destroy itself. That knowledge is never given freely. It is earned through attention, patience, and the willingness to sit with uncomfortable truth. The twins did not escape history. They rewired it. And now that you have heard this, you are no longer a passive witness. You are a carrier of pattern recognition, of awareness, of something institutions quietly fear. Because once a man understands how control systems fail, he stops being predictable. And predictability is the foundation of every empire. We are only halfway down. After the fire, after the silence, after the official forgetting, something subtle shifted across the region. Men who had thrived on inherited authority became cautious. Contracts grew longer. Clauses multiplied. Everyone began protecting themselves from everyone else. That is what exposure does. It does not liberate immediately. Corrodes trust. The twins understood this phase well. They had studied it from the shadows. When a system realizes it can be undone, it becomes paranoid. And paranoia is expensive. It slows decisions. It fractures alliances. It forces errors. They were moved through safe houses, church basements, river towns where questions were considered impolite. Always together. Always quiet. Never listed under the same name twice. They were not hiding. They were being positioned. The network that absorbed them did not operate on ideology. That is a mistake amateurs make. Ideology attracts attention. This network operated on leverage, on evidence gathered patiently and released strategically, on letting men destroy themselves while believing they were still in control. The twins became archivists of human weakness. They cataloged habits, patterns, predictable behaviors among men who thought themselves untouchable. They learned which threats were effective and which were unnecessary. They learned that the most powerful pressure is never public accusation, it is private certainty. Across Louisiana, then Mississippi, Then farther north, deals collapsed without explanation. Judges retired abruptly. Bankers fled quietly. Entire families lost influence in a single season, with no scandal to rally around, no enemy to fight. That is how you dismantle dynasties. Not by confronting them, but by removing the scaffolding that convinces others to support them. The twins never spoke publicly. They never claimed credit. They never sought justice in the way stories prefer. Justice is loud. This was something else. Correction. Rebalancing. The slow return of consequence to places where it had been suspended. And here is the truth that makes people uncomfortable. The system did not collapse. It adjusted. It always does. New men filled the gaps. New hierarchies formed. But something fundamental had changed. Those at the top knew now that invisibility was a liability. That somewhere someone might be watching, recording, waiting. That knowledge alone reshapes behavior. The twins did not end corruption. They introduced uncertainty into its bloodstream. And uncertainty is the beginning of fear. You might be wondering why this story survived at all. If the network was so effective, so thorough, why allow even fragments to remain? Why not erase everything completely? Because total erasure is itself a signal. Institutions understand this instinctively. When too much disappears, questions form. Patterns emerge. Silence becomes suspicious. So instead, they leave controlled traces. Half-truths, conflicting accounts, a mythic outline with no operational detail. This story survives because it was allowed to survive degraded, distorted, dismissed as folklore. That is how dangerous knowledge is neutralized. Not by denial, but by ridicule. The twins became legends. Ghosts, a cautionary tale told without teeth. But legends carry encoded instruction. Men who know how to listen hear the warning beneath the myth. Control is temporary. Records are weapons. And those you refuse to see are often the ones watching most closely. This is why suppressed history matters. Not because of nostalgia, but because the mechanisms repeat. Only the aesthetics change. Today, the ledger is digital. The courthouse is virtual. The fire is bureaucratic instead of literal. Accounts are frozen. Access revoked. Identities erased with a keystroke. And still, the same arrogance persists. Those who believe themselves untouchable always overestimate fear and underestimate observation. They confuse compliance with loyalty, silence with ignorance. They forget that systems depend on people and people learn. The twins' greatest act was not destruction. It was comprehension. They understood the rules without accepting their legitimacy. That distinction changes everything. Once you understand how power actually operates, you stop fighting shadows. You stop chasing villains. You start tracking incentives, dependencies, and weaknesses. This is why awareness feels isolating. Because most people prefer stories with heroes and villains. This story offers neither. Only systems. Only choices. And now only consequences. The descent does not end with revelation. It ends with responsibility. Because knowing how control works places you outside it or inside it consciously. There is no neutral position. This is where we stop pretending this is only history. The Baron believed he was teaching his son's dominance. What he actually taught the world through his downfall was exposure. He demonstrated that control systems rot when they are observed without reverence. The twins were not anomalies. They were inevitabilities. Whenever a structure depends on silence, someone will eventually notice. Whenever power concentrates without accountability, pressure builds. And whenever identities are erased, someone learns to move without one. The danger of this knowledge is not that it inspires rebellion. It inspires clarity. You now know that power fears documentation more than defiance. That systems collapse when forced to reconcile their contradictions. That invisibility, once weaponized, can dismantle empires quietly. This is why such stories are buried. Not because they are horrifying, but because they are instructional. The twins did not win. Winning implies an end. They initiated a cycle. One that continues wherever men believe themselves immune to consequence. And here is the final truth. the one that lingers long after the story ends. Every era creates its barons. Every system creates its ledgers. And every ledger creates witnesses. Most people live their entire lives without realizing which role they occupy. Now you are aware. Awareness changes posture. It changes what you tolerate. It changes how you move through systems designed to predict you. That is why this knowledge is framed as dangerous. Not because it incites chaos, but because it dissolves obedience. The twins vanished into the infrastructure of consequence. Not heroes, not victims, operators. And if this story unsettles you, it should. That discomfort is recognition. The sense that something ancient is still active, still watching. The descent ends here. What you do with what you now understand, that is where the real story begins.